A clergyman had reached the end of his rope, and he decided to try some other way of life, seeking a greater personal satisfaction. The job market was tough, but at last he landed a job in the local zoo. He was going to be in a temporary position until the permanent position came around. As it happened, the chimpanzee had died and had not yet been replaced. The chimp was a great favorite with the children, and the cage could not be left empty for very long. They had a chimp suit, and the man was asked if he would mind getting into the suit and taking the place of the chimp. All he'd have to do was roll around a few times, eat a banana, and then go to the back of the cage and just relax. He decided to give it a go. He was an instant success. The children gathered around his cage. He soon discovered that he was now getting more attention than he ever got in the pulpit. So one day, he decided to really get into the act. And he jumped up, he grabbed an overhead bar and began to swing back and forth, to and fro, and the children delighted with screams. He got a little carried away with himself, and he really began to swing with gusto. Unfortunately, after one huge effort, his hands slipped, and he went flying over the partition into the next cage, where a huge tiger approached. And as that tiger approached, forgetting that he was supposed to be a chimp, he screamed, "Help! Help!" To which the tiger whispered, "Shut up, you fool! I'm a minister too!" Well, the moral of the story: we are all the same when we stand before God. We are all the same when we stand before God. And this brings me to the two characters in the gospel. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. For all practical purposes, the Pharisee seemed to be doing fairly well spiritually, right? He wasn't greedy, he wasn't dishonest, he wasn't an adulterer, he fasted twice a week, he paid his tithes, he even prayed at the temple regularly. Generally speaking, Pharisees were seen as those who were expected to do the right things and to live a morally good life. The tax collector, on the other hand, was seen as something of a scoundrel, since he was a Jew who turned traitor to his own people by becoming an employee of the Roman government and extorting from his own Jewish people. Now, obviously, the problem is the motivation of these two individuals. The Pharisee was so busy comparing himself to the tax collector, and probably to everyone else, and seeing himself as so self-righteous, was quick to pass judgment on the tax collector. Now, interestingly, both characters are in the temple to pray. That's why they're there. Because the temple was considered a holy place of encounter with God. And so this is when we begin to see the true colors of these characters. The Pharisee seemed to be missing that connection with God. Instead of speaking his prayer to God, did you notice in the gospel it said he prayed to himself? And then he diligently itemized all his accomplishments. I have done this, and this, and this. I, me. The unholy trinity, me, myself, and I. And by focusing on his righteous acts, he was not really making himself present to God. He was not inviting God to be present to him either. So he missed the chance to encounter God and receive his mercy and his grace. So in this sense, the Pharisee left the temple basically exactly the same way as he had entered the temple. Let's turn to the tax collector now, on the other hand, who, it says, stood off at a distance and would not even look up to heaven with his eyes, but rather beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." He laid himself bare before God. He knew that his failings and unworthiness, and he had no list of righteous acts to display to God. He opened his heart and begged for mercy. And there, in that vulnerable, humble moment, God and man came together in a real way. And so the tax collector left the temple and went home a changed, a new man. You see, so often I think we get caught up in comparing ourselves and judging ourselves compared to others, that we forget that the only comparison that matters is our comparison with Jesus Christ. He is the model for our lives. That's the only comparison that matters. And that's why this parable is often referred to as a mirror parable. Because when we look at ourselves in the mirror, which character do we see? The judging Pharisee or the humble tax collector? That reminds me of a situation with my mom. Just a few years ago, she called me laughing at herself hysterically. She was living in Florida in one of those senior communities, 55 and above. And she told me how she was talking to one of her friends. Now, mind you, my mom and her friend, they were chatting together, were both well into their 80s at the time. And my mom said to her friend, "I saw so-and-so whom I haven't seen in years, and I was surprised at how old she got." To which my mom's friend said to my mother, "Francesca, have you looked in the mirror lately?" I think that really kind of puts a perspective on things. We are all here in our temple to pray the perfect prayer, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, where Jesus is offering himself to the Father on our behalf. As we look at the other individuals around us, and also as we look at the mirror of our lives, will we look at like the Pharisee or like the tax collector? The tax collector knew that we are all the same when we stand before God. A sinner in need of his mercy.